Hello and welcome to another professional development training. This time we'll be dealing with instructional objectives, one of the key ideas behind curriculum development and behind good teaching. Today we'll look at defining what outcomes are or are not, why we should use them, and we'll look at the three components of an outcome and how we can best tie those into our instruction, including the use of Bloom's verbs. And finally we'll try to distinguish good from bad outcomes. So what are they? A learning outcome is an end. It's not a mean. It's where we want the students to finish what they're able to do when everything is all said and done. They need to be very clearly measured. The sort of fuzzy-wuzzy outcomes such as a student has to understand is almost impossible to measure. We're looking at very specific things. Can the student do this activity that I can watch and record? Learning outcomes are focused on the student. We don't really care about the teacher. The teacher is going to be able to teach toward those learning outcomes, but the learning outcomes don't tell us how to actually teach them. That's a whole different issue. Here you see our definition. A clear learning outcome is what is to be learned and how we measure the achievement of that learning. So it's really two different components that we're looking at when we look at learning outcomes. Why bother using them? First of all, it's again about clarity. By having a learning outcome, students know what they're supposed to do in order to be successful, and teachers know the endpoint. Whenever you have an outcome, you also have embedded within it an assessment. In other words, I have to be able to measure the achievement of the outcome, something I can't do if I don't know what the endpoint's supposed to be. The end result of all this thinking about curricula and thinking about student outcomes is that we tend to have a much clearer sense of what should be in a given course and how a given course fits into the overall curricula for the program at hand. There's really no downside to learning outcomes if they're done properly, and today's lesson is going to be about how to do them properly. There are three components of a learning outcome: green, yellow, and red: performance, conditions, and criteria. They all fit together to give us an idea of what the student needs to accomplish. When it comes to performance, it's really telling us what must be done. It focuses on the verb, we'll talk about that in just a minute, of what the student must accomplish. The conditions, on the other hand, deal with the settings in which these performances must be accomplished. And finally, the criteria is looking at what standard has to be applied to see whether or not the student achieved a learning outcome. So let's look at each of these three components, one after the other, to build up a better view of what a learning outcome actually is. Performance can be defined as what the student can do after training. That's it. It's focused on the student. It doesn't tell me how to teach, and this is where many instructors who are first trying to write learning outcomes get confused. Because they're teachers, they tend to focus on the needs of teachers, and they write their objectives in a sense as to a way of teaching the topic. And that's not what we want. We want the endpoint. What should the student be able to do once the topic is taught? There are two types of performance, overt and covert. Overt performance is the easiest one to measure. It's right in front of you. You can see it. You can measure it. No matter who looks at it, we all tend to measure it the same way. That one's not very tough. The one that is difficult is covert. And covert are the internal critical thinking style performances that may be difficult to directly assess. So we need to have an indicator behavior. I can't watch you dividing two 4-digit numbers, but I can see your answer that you come up with, and I can see the methodology you're writing out. Those indicator behaviors are enough to tell me that you can, in fact, divide the numbers. When we're looking at performance, it is all driven by the verbs used in the performance frame, and those verbs are from Bloom. Bloom's taxonomy is a list of 6 different levels of learning, from the most basic, knowledge, moving up through comprehension and application into the critical thinking areas of analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. As you see in this chart, there are a number of verbs associated with each one of these levels in Bloom's taxonomy. The benefit behind these verbs is it allows an instructor who's receiving a series of learning outcomes to know what level to teach at. If I see, for instance, the learning outcome for today is to name the 3 components of a learning outcome, that's fairly simple. I don't have to go very deep into the topic. On the other hand, if I want you to construct learning outcomes, that's a deeper level of learning and a harder level of teaching. I have to teach much more than I would if I just have you name the three components. It's important for you to know what Bloom's verbs are. If you stray away from these, if you use verbs like understand or gain an appreciation of, you're going to go down a rat hole it's going to be very hard to get back out of. So do look at these verbs and use them as your starting point when you're first trying to develop learning outcomes. So we've talked about performance. That was what we're trying to get the students to do. Now the conditions, the second part of a learning outcome, deal with what's going to help or hurt the student in trying to achieve that particular outcome. For instance, if I am trying to play with a piñata, blindfolding the child and spinning him around makes it much more difficult for the child to hit the piñata. If, on the other hand, I gave him a heavy bat, took the blindfold off, and slowed the piñata down to no movement at all, it'd be very easy to hit the piñata. So the idea of a condition is, when will the student have to use this knowledge, this skill? When will the student have to have this performance? If I'm looking at, say, an emergency room doctor as opposed to a general practitioner, the conditions that an emergency room doctor has to deal with a patient are far different than those of a regular family practice doctor. Even though we're looking at the same thing, a broken leg is a broken leg, but if I'm getting it in an emergency room, it's going to be with a lot more stress, a lot more tension, and a lot more people involved than if it's just somebody coming in saying, I just broke my leg out in the parking lot. So with the conditions, it's important to be very specific, very explicit as to what can and cannot be used. Don't assume, especially in today's environment, that the students will just arbitrarily come up with the same set of conditions that you had in your mind. You know, they're all digital. They're going to come up with, oh, well, I was able to use Wikipedia. You didn't say I couldn't use Wikipedia. Oh, well, I looked it up on Google. You didn't say I couldn't Google. Oh, well, we got together and decided what the answer was. You didn't say we couldn't work as a team. So it's very important for you to make sure that you clearly state what students can and cannot use when they're dealing with the performances in the learning outcomes. We talked about performance, the green. We talked about conditions, the yellow. Now we're talking about criteria, the red. And that's looking at how well the student has to perform. For Coleman, for instance, we say you have to have a minimum of 70% when it comes to completion of things in order for you to successfully graduate. So if you're looking at 70%, all right, that is a criteria. You could use national standards. For instance, if I'm recertifying for my CPR designation, there are certain things I have to do. I have to be able to compress the chest a certain number of times and know the rules. These things are criteria from the American Heart Association. If I meet those criteria, I've met the learning outcomes. So if I meet the criteria, then I have performed sufficiently well that I meet the outcomes, and therefore I'm considered to be certified for CPR. The criteria are going to tell us at what level of accuracy these folks need to perform. Of the three components, performance, conditions, and criteria, criteria is the one we can safely leave off if I have a more general statement. So, for instance, if for all of the learning objectives in the course, I say you have to complete this at a 70% level or higher, I don't have to include that in every single learning outcome. I can get away with just having a performance and a condition. But it's not a bad habit to get into to try to write all three components at once. So we've seen the three pieces, performance, condition, criteria. Let's see if we can actually make these things work. Let's take a look at some outcomes and see if we can recognize the parts. So looking at the first one here, given a brick, hammer a nail completely into a plank without bending the nail. Can you identify the performance? Can you identify the condition? Can you identify the criteria? Well, let's take a look. Given a brick is the condition. Hammer, the Bloom's verb, the blue, is part of the performance to hammer a nail. And the criteria is completely into a plank without bending the nail. In other words, that's the go, no-go. Let's try the second one. Without the use of notes, list three components of a learning outcome. So again, performance, criteria, and condition. Which is which? Without the use of notes is the condition. That's the status we're going to bring you into. List is the Bloom's verb. The three components of a learning outcome is what you must do. List the three components of a learning outcome. Notice there is no criterion there. So you either can or cannot list the three components of a learning outcome. You have to get all three. Let's try the third one. Determine the project with the highest net present value. Can you determine performance, condition, and criteria? Take a moment. Do you notice that this is really all performance? In situations like this, what you have is something that looks like or resembles a learning outcome, but is in fact a test item. It's something that you would be putting on a document asking the students to do, not something they need to achieve in general at the end of the class. Perhaps a better way of stating that would be this. Notice much more general, and it has all the components. Given a project, the condition, calculate, Bloom's verb, its net present value. Again, no criterion. The assumption here is it's either correct or it's not correct. But this gives you a quick sort of down and dirty view of what good learning outcomes are. A couple of things you want to avoid, however. No fluffy verbs. No understands. No will appreciate. Things that can't be measured shouldn't be in your learning outcomes. Make sure the learning outcomes are relevant to the course and to the program outcomes. State the conditions at least and the criteria if need be. Make sure that the verbs match the desired Bloom level, and have a good description of what must be learned. That's pretty much it. Thanks for your time. Remember, you do have three components: performance, condition, and criteria, and you want to write these in a clear way using Bloom's verbs. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you watch more of these. We appreciate your time. Thank you much.